Okay, it is Tuesday, March 17th. That's not true. It's Tuesday, April 17th, excuse me. And we are on the downside of the semester. We have completed 3 exams, a majority of the quizzes. So what we have left are the 3 quizzes. You took one to open up this particular lecture, and then we have 2 more. So there's 30 quiz points starting with this quiz. There'll also be an extra credit that should be posted under this week of public opinion and the media, and then we have a final exam. So we are getting close to the end of the semester. In fact, 3 weeks left starting today. 3 weeks and then finals week. So we have 3 more topics: public opinion and the media, which is this week's. We'll have political parties, elections, and how we participate next week, and then a short chapter on interest groups the last week of class. All right, so let's talk a little bit about public opinion. The study of American public opinion aims to understand how the distribution or the distribution of the population's beliefs about politics and policy issues. So we have lots of studies done, both academically as well as in the papers. Journalists do a lot of studies to try and figure out what public opinion is, and how it is that the people, the masses of society, what their beliefs are about politics and particular issues. It seems simple enough, but there are problems, and there's 3 of them, so I want you to jot these down. One is that there are many different groups with a variety of opinions in America. We are not a homogeneic society. We are heterogeneous. There are lots of different groups that make up different interests, therefore they have different opinions about what they want the government to do. So that's the first problem, that there's many different groups. Secondly, measuring public opinion can be difficult, and this requires polling and some statistics, but basically you have to understand what you're asking and whether or not people understand what you're asking in terms of polling. And we can make numbers and polls say just about anything we want. So both Democrats and Republicans in this country have polling professionals, people who go out and poll individuals to try and figure out what they want, what they're wanting to vote on, and who they're supporting. And then lastly, the third issue is that the American public is generally not well informed regarding political issues unless they're salient. And salient simply means that they are of importance to a particular person at a particular time. We might have a lot of different interests, but none of them are salient. That is, they're not really pressing issues for us. But if you suddenly have a medical condition, if you're suddenly injured, you might become more interested in health care. If you are dealing with issues of immigration, then or trying to move from one country to the other, then immigration issues might be a salient issue for you. If you've lost your job and can't afford health care, then health care might be a salient issue for you. Okay, so let's look at the objectives. We're going to have 2 different parts. Part 1 is we'll talk about who exactly the public is and whose opinion really matters. How do we get these opinions that we have, and how do we measure opinion? And then the second lecture on public opinion deals with what exactly does the public really know, and given the fact that the public may not know a lot about particular issues, how do leaders then react to public opinion? And then we'll close with a discussion of what are the major ideologies in America and what factors influence ideologies that then influence people's opinions. All right, so who is the public? We tend to think of the public as the whole population in the United States, but we can also start thinking about them according to different demographics, different groups of people. And the United States has one particular tool to help categorize the public, and that's the census. And we've already talked about the census when we talked about Congress. So remember, every 10 years, the census provides the U.S. with certain types of information that's important for reapportionment, but also provides information about who makes up America. And so this is important because who makes up America will influence public opinion. And one of the ways that the who makes a difference, one way that we get different groups in America is through immigration. So increases in immigration will alter public opinion. John F. Kennedy once said that America is not merely a nation, but a nation of nations. And so the term nation is technically referring to a group of people that have a common heritage, language, background, ethnicity, etc. And the federal law allows up to 800,000 new immigrants to be legally admitted into the country every year. And so this is basically like adding a city the size of Indianapolis every year to the general public. And so with these new waves of immigration, all these new individuals coming in, that's going to change public opinion. And there have been three great waves of immigration to the United States. Prior to the 19th century, in the 1800s, you had Northwestern European immigration. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, that is the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you had much more immigration from the southern and eastern parts of Europe, where you had lots of Italians, Polish, Russians, and these immigrants are the ones we tend to envision the most when we think about Ellis Island and the pictures we see of immigrants going through Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty area. And of course, more recent decades, we've had an increase in the Hispanic immigration as well as Asian immigration. And of course, we had some immigration to the United States, obviously, with African Americans, mainly against their will during the days of slavery. So with each wave of immigration, you have different issues and new issues becoming important in terms of public opinion. So for African Americans, political and economic equality, urbanization issues tend to rate high in terms of interest, as well as education. Hispanics, obviously, similar issues in terms of political and economic equality, the issue of immigration. And so for each wave of immigration, these different issues become more salient to them. But beyond immigration, there's a regional shift as well that's going to influence public opinion. So there is a movement from the east and northeast states into the south and southwest. So that migration of population from the Rust Belt to the Bible Belt or to the Sun Belt means that different regions now have different views about certain political issues. The South has traditionally been a more conservative region, the West Coast much more liberal, as is the Northeast. And so those individuals who are moving are going to influence public opinion to wherever they're moving to. And then there's one last demographic influence on public opinion, and that's the graying of America, or what we call the elderly. Okay, this is the fastest growing group nationwide, and it impacts some states more than others. So think about snowbirds. If you hear the term snowbirds, these are individuals who might have lived up in the north where there's lots of snow, and they've permanently moved to Florida. Okay, so they migrated, as a bird would, away from the snow into a nice area. And why do they do that? It's warmer, they're retired, there's no need to live in an environment where there's so much work associated with the snow. So the issues that are important to them are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And many people move to Florida because they don't have a state income tax, just like we don't. All right, but for the purposes of political science, there's really two kinds of ways to think of the term public in terms of public opinion. While we tend to refer to the public as including everyone who is not holding an elected governmental office, that's kind of us versus them, those in the public opinion field tend to define public opinion a little bit differently. They think of a public as being a group of people that share a common attitude or predisposition which leads them to act in a similar way. So again, the public is a group of people that share a common attitude or predisposition which leads them to act in a similar way. So for example, there's a public that likes Social Security and tends to get involved in politics when those benefits are decreased. Another public might not just like that, but they might love cats and dogs, for example, and therefore they'll tend to be against the use of animals in medical experiments more than other folks might. So you have different publics that are out there in America. And the other way to think of public opinion is an expressed attitude. So we might think of defining public opinion as the collective expressions of attitudes about the prominent issues and actors of the day. So public opinion is the shared opinions or the collective opinions of individuals that have a common concern on prominent issues and actors of the day. So what are attitudes? Attitudes is just your specific preference for things, and we'll talk about how attitudes and opinions are developed momentarily. And values are principles that shape a person's opinions, and in our case, opinions about politics. Well, then we might need to think about whose public opinion matters, and this gets into some theory about public opinion. And the first theory is this concept of pluralism. And so these theories attempt to answer the question of how people in the society participate and affect politics. So in general, the theory of pluralism suggests that political power is widely scattered throughout American society. The results or the outputs of government, the policies of government, are reached through the bargaining of these different groups or segments which have organized themselves more or less into interest groups. So you have business interests, you have environmental interests, and between these two different groups and their opinions, some sort of bargaining is going to occur between these groups that is going to result in a particular policy output. So for example, one issue is whether or not it should be mandatory for employers to give maternity and child care leave to parents. And there's several different groups that take part in that debate, and they have opinions. So unions, for example, might be very interested in this particular issue because it's going to provide another benefit for their members. Industry leaders, on the other hand, might think that granting such maternity and child care leave is going to be an unfair burden for them to try and replace that worker or hold that job for when the worker returns. The National Organization for Women would be very much in favor of this particular type of policy because it represents a step forward for mothers who wish to stay in the workforce. So here you have three different groups, three different publics who have an opinion about a particular issue, and they're going to try and advocate for that position. So the pluralists believe that in the long term the results are democratic in the sense that there's eventual compromise representing the averages, if you will, of the interests that compete for a particular issue. Congress makes the decisions, but many segments or publics in the society have an input on this particular process. So that's one view. The other view is that we have elites in America that makes these decisions for us. So power over the important decisions in America are monopolized by three elites. You have the economic leaders or the economic elites who push for particular issues. For example, you have the military elite who might depend upon the economic leaders for equipment and lobbying support for, let's say, military production. And you have the political elite. This is the president and his cabinet. And they depend upon the economic and military elite for their support, but especially the economic elites because it's the donations and support from the economic elites that are necessary to win re-election. So that leaves two groups. There is the middle elite, which consists mainly of Congress, but also of other public interest group leaders, movers and shakers in the entrepreneurial world, for example, or other types of organizations. And they might make some mildly important decisions, but all decisions of national or international importance are really made by this ruling or power elite. And then there's us, the mass society, a group of people that rarely expresses opinions on politics to those that rule American society. I mean, think about it. When do you express your opinion to those who run the government? Basically, it's through voting. And oftentimes, it might not be even our own opinions. It might be the opinions of the media, for example. Rarely do we think out our own opinions when it comes to a lot of political issues. And a lot of political issues, unless they're salient, we may not know a whole lot about. So for people who don't have medical issues or don't have issues with unemployment, they may not know the intricacies of having to deal with certain type of medical issues, health insurance, or unemployment insurance. C. Wright Mills had this quote. He was a sociologist. He says, "At the top there has emerged an elite whose power probably exceeds that of any small group of men in world history. The middle levels are often a drifting set of stalemated forces. The bottom of this society is politically fragmented and increasingly powerless. At the bottom there is emerging a mass society." And this, unfortunately for us, is where most of us are, this mass society. Okay. But in more modern times, this mass society is able to express its opinion much more vocally and much more relevantly through the power of the media, and specifically through social media. Social media is really changing the nature of public opinion. So how are these opinions developed? Okay. Where do you get your opinions about political issues from? Okay. Each and every one of you is affected by what goes on around you. So if we want to understand why you believe what you believe, we need to study the process of what is called political socialization, which is how things around you affect the way you learn about politics. Okay. So political socialization is the process which an individual requires their particular political orientations, that is, their knowledge, feelings, evaluations regarding their political world. And it's not necessarily a formal process, it's something we learn over time, and it's often accidental. There is forced socialization. Think about the Nazi youth groups, for example, or some other type of indoctrination process. Okay, but generally speaking, our political socialization are ingrained rather than acquired. It's not like you go down to the store and purchase your political socialization. Over time, there are some things that will affect how you view politics. The number one way that we are influenced by politics is through these different agents of socialization. So the most important agent of socialization are your family, more specifically your parents. Political studies have been done to answer the question of how political attitudes develop over time. Surveys of parents were done early on in the childhood years, and the development of political beliefs were studied. So the best predictor of what political party you belong to is what your parents, or who your parents belong to. If your parents identify with the same party, the chances are that you'll come to identify with that party as well. What about cases where your parents were of different parties? Okay. If they're split, most people tend to identify with the party of their father. That's according to the studies that were done in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. More recently, however, this is changing because of the dynamic changes of the family unit. So it's becoming less predominant that your dad's influence is going to be your primary influence, particularly with single mothers and single parenthood. Okay. But the family's role in socialization is central because it is of its ability to really monopolize two important resources in a person's early years: your time and your emotional commitment. Okay? And in your formative years, you spend all that time and emotion with your parents. But as the child approaches adolescence and goes off to college, for example, rebellion against parents and their beliefs and values are common. This is particularly true starting in the 60s and 70s during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and during the Vietnam era. There's empirical evidence suggesting that there is a generational gap, but that was probably more high than reality. Researchers have found far more agreement than disagreement across generalizations. And in fact, what sometimes happens is that when you go to college, you'll deviate from your family's kind of political position, but might migrate back after you have children yourself. Another agent of socialization are schools. Okay. In most states, high school students are required to take some sort of government course to graduate. The idea is that this fosters interest and participation in democracy and encourages good citizenship. On the other hand, it could be argued that there's something that politics is something that shouldn't be taught in public schools because of the possibility of brainwashing or indoctrination. Okay, but the schools you go to, the schools you attend, the schools, particularly high school and college, might influence your political socialization. Now, we're just talking about the school, the institution itself. The third agent of socialization are your peers, your friends, acquaintances, those who you associate with on a regular basis. Okay. So I know many of you just sit around and talk about politics on a regular basis, but you probably do inadvertently and in ways that may not be something where you're thinking that you're sitting down talking about politics. There's a lot of different issues that are political in nature that you probably talk about every day. And so one of the early studies that looked at the influence of peer groups was done in the Bennington study. Okay. And so I have a graph about that particular college study. Looking at the 1936 election between Alfred Landon, who was the Republican candidate, and Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Democratic, and then there was a third candidate, Norman Thomas, the researcher discovered something very interesting if you look across time. 66% of the parents of freshmen, that's what the PF means, 66% of the parents of freshmen supported Landon, the Republican. And their daughters were this is an all-girls school. The daughters were very close in terms of who they supported. An even higher level of parents of sophomores, 69%, supported Landon, but the percentage of their daughters doing so dropped dramatically. So between freshmen and sophomores at Bennington College, support had deviated away from their parents. Okay. By their junior and senior years, only 15% of Bennington students supported Landon. So what the researcher concluded was that this is an example of political socialization, not only by the institution, but probably peers. What was happening is that the school's more liberal teachers were shaping the students' political beliefs. And this is a belief that goes on in academics across the United States as well as other countries, that there's an idea that students come and become much more liberal due to their college experience. I would hope that your professors allow you to figure out what your own political views are and not try to influence your political views. So it doesn't matter to me if you are a conservative, liberal, moderate, or a socialist for that matter. What matters to me is that you start to form your own political opinions. All right. Besides families, schools, and peer groups, then we have the media, which is an influence. And of course, we can think of Jon Stewart, for example. A study indicated that most individuals between 18 and 24 get their news from Jon Stewart, which he will tell you he's not a newscaster. But if that's where you're getting your news, that is fine. You're getting some sort of insight into the political news of the day. Well, how do we end up keeping our opinions about things? Each of us has a tendency to screen out information that we don't want to see or hear. Things that seem to disagree or contradict our political beliefs we tend to ignore. That is called perceptual screening. We do this because we want to avoid what is called cognitive dissonance or confusion. And think about news, okay? The people who watch Fox News are screening out what's going on CNN or MSNBC because they don't want to hear that different point of view that doesn't set well with the views they have. Conversely, those who watch MSNBC, for example, are not going to watch Fox News because they want to screen out that particular information coming from Fox News, which is reported to be much more conservative. So it doesn't fit with what they believe, and if they watch it, then it's going to lead to what is called cognitive dissonance or confusion. Okay, when we see something that disagrees with our beliefs about politics, we try to somehow fit it into our belief structure, and it's sometimes like fitting a square peg into a round hole. But we fit it in, and we tend to ignore it because it's hard to rethink our belief. It's tough emotionally. It's really tough to go along for the first 18 years of your life believing one thing and then get exposed to different ideas in college that totally change your world. It's tough emotionally. It's hard to think through those things theoretically, so it's easier to ignore the information that disagrees with our own opinions. And this happens a lot. Okay, and this is why we tend to keep the opinions that we have. Okay. All right, well, how do we measure these opinions? How does a government, or how does a president, or how does a senator know what the public wants? And this is where polling comes in. Okay, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about polling. Okay, there's different ways to think about how we measure things. One is called a straw poll, and this is a non-scientific method of measuring public opinion. It's not random. You might end up having 200 people in a room that have similar beliefs, and you basically ask them to raise their hands about certain issues. It's like a thermometer. You're like testing just to see the waters, testing the waters to see how people are feeling about a particular issue. That's called a straw poll. And we see this on the news a lot when these on the street or man on the street interviews where a journalist basically goes up to 6 different people trying to get a voice of the public or the common man's view on a particular issue. Okay, so it's not scientific. In order to be scientific in polling, you have to have what is called a random or probability sample. And this is simply a sample or a strategy that will allow you to give every member potentially an equal chance of appearing in the sample. we can't go and ask everybody, even in the city of Huntsville, their opinions about political issues. So we take a random sample. It might just be picking every 10th person out of the phone book in the old days when everyone was listed in the phone. But somehow, some way, all these names are put into a big barrel and everyone has the same chance of appearing in the sample. And the purpose of the sample is to be a representation of the population at large. So we can't poll everybody. We want to get a sample that's supposed to represent the population at large. And random probability sampling requires statistical analysis that we're not going to do here, but you might have to learn this in statistics class someday. You're just going to have to trust that when you sample 1,000 people in America, that's enough people to get a random sample of the views of America at large. Okay. But obviously there is something called the margin of error. And this means that there's a possibility that there's something really wrong with the survey or that there's not really a true representation. And this just means that the number for the entire the numbers for the entire population of voters will fall within a range of plus or minus of the number obtained from the small but representative sample of voters. So again, we can't sample everyone. So in this particular sample of this particular question, this was back in 2008, talking about which would be your description of would you be excited, pleased, disappointed, afraid if one of these individuals were elected. So they sampled 2,011 adults. All right. Well, obviously there's much more people in the United States than that. And so these 2,000 individuals are the random sample that's supposed to represent the entire population. Statistically, we can say that we are sure that these people represent the population at large. So we can say for sure that 17% of Americans are excited about the possibility of Barack Obama becoming president, plus or minus 3 percentage points. That's the margin of error. So what this is saying is that in the sample we took, 17% were excited about Barack Obama, and that is representative of the entire population with a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. So statistically, if we were able to talk to every single person in America, this number would fall somewhere between 14% and 20%. So that's what that plus or minus is. The bigger the number here, the plus or minus, the less confident you are about the survey. The smaller the number, the more confident you are about the survey. Okay? So even though Barack Obama and John Edwards seem to be 8 points apart, this might be 13 and this might have been 12. Okay? But generally speaking, we can kind of look at this and say 17% of the public were excited about Barack Obama becoming president, 33% were pleased, plus or minus 3 points. So that's what that plus or minus means when you see that in surveys. Okay? All right. Polls are important because it helps us understand and helps the people running for office understand where they sit in terms of the views of the American public. So tracking polls are used by the media to track the support that candidates have over time. And we'll start seeing these after the conventions in this summer for the November election between Barack Obama and who will probably be Mitt Romney. So we'll start seeing these tracking polls to see how their support either increases or decreases from the time of the conventions to the presidential election. And then the day of the election, we'll have what are called exit polls. And these are polls that question the voter as they leave the voting booth to try to predict the outcome of an election. And many people are discouraged by exit polls, and in fact we have instituted some laws more recently that talk about how soon can a news outlet report exit polling. Okay, and so think about what the exit poll will do. And there's one really good example. Back in the 1980 election, Jimmy Carter gave a speech conceding to Ronald Reagan even before the polls closed on the West Coast because of the exit polls indicated he wasn't going to win. Well, if he's already lost most of the eastern seaboard states, he's basically conceding the election. And if you're a Democrat on the West Coast, you may think, why should I even go vote? And so some Democratic candidates out west may have lost in close races as a result, because many Democrats stayed home feeling there wasn't any use to going and voting because the exit polls showed that Jimmy Carter was going to lose. Okay. So there are some arguments about why we should not have exit polls to advertise to the public how well a candidate is doing while voting is still occurring. All right, so exit polls might not be a good idea. Tracking polls tends to help candidates and the public know where each candidate stands in terms of the election. All right, we're going to take a break, but here's a poll that was taken and reinforcing what American political values are. Remember, the American political values are liberty, equality, and democracy. Okay, so a poll was asked about particular issues in terms of whether or not homosexuals should have equal rights in terms of job opportunities. And this falls under the value of equality of opportunity, and 89% polled agreed with that. How concerned are you about government monitoring your personal information? This deals with the liberty issue. 56% were very or somewhat concerned about that. Any group should be allowed to hold a rally for any cause. This is the idea of democracy, and 69% people agreed upon that. So you can poll just about anything you're interested in terms of politics. All right, we'll continue talking about public opinion in the next lecture.